The sound of a door slamming echoed through the silent streets. A teenager, trembling, stood at the edge of the sidewalk, his chest heavy with fear. His heart pounded as he watched the police car drive away, knowing what was about to happen next. For years, he'd been pushed aside, ignored, and ridiculed, but now, the game was about to change. Why was he the target? What had he done to deserve this? Was it just another act of hate, or was something darker at play? Stay tuned to find out what happens when one boy stands against a system built on injustice. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are listening. Your support means everything. Jason wasn't the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. Quiet, observant, and always keeping to himself, he blended in with the ebb and flow of life in his small suburban town. He spent most days walking home from school, earbuds in, lost in his own world of music and thoughts. Life, for him, was simple. At least, that's what it seemed on the surface. He lived in a modest apartment with his mom, who worked long hours as a nurse. Jason understood the sacrifices she made for him, and in return, he stayed out of trouble, kept his grades up, and rarely asked for more than what they already had. He liked to think he was doing his part. The world outside his home was a place of small victories and defeats, the usual teenage hurdles, like making the basketball team, finishing an essay before the deadline, or occasionally hanging out with his friends at the park. But the outside world also had a way of reminding Jason that, despite all the small wins, things weren't always as fair as they seemed. The school hallways were filled with the usual chatter, groups of students laughing, gossiping, and making plans for the weekend. Jason passed through it all, his eyes trained on the ground, mind preoccupied with the math test he had just taken. It was only when he reached the door to his next class that he felt the shift. A soft chuckle from behind him, a snide remark thrown into the air, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps quickly matching his own pace. Jason glanced over his shoulder, and there they were, Derek and his group, laughing like they had just cracked some joke at his expense. "Hey Jason, how's it feel to be the only black kid in advanced English?" Derek's voice was loud enough for others to hear, and Jason could feel the heat of the gaze from passing students. Jason kept his head down, pretending he didn't hear it. It wasn't the first time they targeted him. Derek had made comments like this before, calling him out for the way he spoke, his grades, even the way he dressed. They'd always been subtle enough for Jason to ignore, but he knew. He knew what it was. It wasn't just the comments. It wasn't just about the kids who thought it was funny to point out the color of his skin as if it was something to mock. It was the way the teachers looked at him when he raised his hand in class, like they didn't expect him to know the answer. It was the way the principal always gave him a long look when he showed up to pick up his report card. It was the way some of his classmates never quite treated him the same as the others. Not all of them, but enough to make him feel like an outsider. Jason had always told himself that he could deal with it, that it was just part of growing up. He knew the world was flawed, that some people were ignorant, but that didn't mean it had to define him. He told himself it didn't matter. But today, something felt different. The usual taunts didn't just sting, they simmered under his skin, a constant reminder of the pressure he'd always carried. It wasn't just the boys at school. It was everything, everywhere, all at once. As he sat in class, staring at the pages of his history book, Jason's thoughts wandered. What would it feel like to just not have to think about it? What would it feel like to not be treated differently because of the color of his skin? To be seen as just Jason, and not Jason, the black kid. The bell rang, and Jason quickly packed up his things, eager to escape the thoughts swirling in his mind. He didn't look up as he walked past Derek, not this time. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction, but as he turned the corner, he noticed something. A group of teachers were gathered by the lockers, whispering in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward him. It wasn't anything new. Teachers had always looked at him a little differently, ever since he was a kid, always holding a little more skepticism, always expecting a little less. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just the students. Jason paused for a second, his gut tightening. He didn't know why, but it felt like something was about to happen. Something that was going to change everything. It was just a feeling, one of those gut instincts he couldn't explain. He shook his head and continued walking, telling himself it was nothing. He had bigger things to focus on. What he didn't know was that in the next few hours. The small injustices he had learned to live with would snowball into something far bigger than he could have imagined. Something that would expose the ugly truth of the world he'd been living in. And it would all start with one moment. One look, one accusation. As Jason made his way to the exit, he had no idea that today, the world would finally make him confront the reality he had spent years trying to ignore. The tension was building, and the first domino was about to fall. Jason had hoped it was all in his head, that he had just been overthinking it. But that evening, as the shadows stretched across the streets and the wind carried the faint hum of city traffic, he knew something was off. The feeling was heavier now, like a thick fog surrounding him, suffocating him with every step. As he walked home from school that day, the usual sounds of the neighborhood felt distant. His shoes scuffed against the sidewalk as his mind raced. The whispering teachers, the glances, the feeling that something bigger than just schoolyard teasing was building. His stomach churned. The world felt suddenly small and overwhelming. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to check a text from his best friend, Malik. Malik, you good? I saw you with Derek today. You okay? Jason stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keys. He wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't just Derek. It wasn't just today. It was everything that had been building up for so long, like cracks in the walls that no one could see until they finally gave way. Jason had grown tired of pretending it didn't bother him. Jason, I don't know, man. Something's not right. I can feel it. I don't know how much more of this I can take. He put the phone back in his pocket and kept walking, trying to ignore the unease creeping up his spine. But it wasn't easy. As he turned the corner into his block, he saw it. The flash of a police car's lights. The familiar blue and red glow that never failed to make his stomach knot. The car was parked outside his building. Jason's heart rate picked up as he approached. What was going on? Was his mom okay? He quickened his pace. As he reached the steps to the building, he saw two officers standing by the door. They weren't talking to his mom, though. Instead, they were talking to his neighbor, a middle-aged white man named Mr. Walker, who had lived next door for as long as Jason could remember. Walker looked agitated, shaking his head, his hands flailing as he argued with the officers. I'm telling you, this kid is a menace. Mr. Walker's voice cracked with anger. He's been hanging around here, walking the streets, acting like he owns the place. Jason froze. The words hit him like a slap to the face. He knew exactly what this was about. Mr. Walker had been a problem for as long as Jason could remember. Always making comments, always eyeing him like he was some kind of criminal. But now, the whispers had taken a new form. They weren't just words anymore. They had turned into accusations. Jason's blood ran cold. He didn't know what to do. Should he speak up? Should he defend himself? But what good would it do? The truth had never mattered when it came to people like Mr. Walker. He stood there for a moment, fighting the urge to confront the man. But before he could make a move, one of the officers turned. Spotting him standing there, "Is this the kid?" the officer asked, his voice flat and professional. But there was an edge to it that made Jason's stomach drop. Jason nodded, swallowing hard. "That's him, officer," Mr. Walker said, a smile creeping onto his face. "He's the one I've been telling you about." Jason tried to keep his voice steady. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Walker. I don't even know what you're talking about." But the officer wasn't listening. He was already pulling out a notebook, scribbling down something. "Stay right there, kid," the officer ordered. Jason's mind was racing. His heart pounded in his chest, his fists clenched at his sides. He had no idea what to do. He had been a model student. He had always kept his head down. And now this. He felt like the world was closing in around him. How had things escalated so quickly? Why had Mr. Walker decided to target him now? The other officer stepped closer, and Jason could feel the weight of his gaze. "Mr. Walker, are you sure about this?" "Oh, I'm sure," Mr. Walker replied with a venomous grin. "I've seen him hanging around the block, looking suspicious. You know what they say, officer. If it looks like trouble, it probably is." The words echoed in Jason's head as the officer jotted down more notes, his face unreadable. The tension was suffocating, and Jason's breath quickened. "Jason!" His mom's voice suddenly called from the hallway. She had just come out of their apartment, eyes wide in confusion as she saw the officers. The officers turned, but the situation wasn't over. Jason could tell that the seed had already been planted. The accusation had been made, and now they were just going through the motions. He felt his mother's gaze on him, the concern in her eyes, but also something else, fear. "Mom, I didn't do anything," Jason said, his voice shaking. She looked between Jason and the officers, her expression tight with worry. The officer who had been questioning Jason turned his attention to her now, clearly assessing the situation. "We've received reports," the officer began, his tone more formal, "that there's been some suspicious activity in this area. Your son was seen hanging around the block earlier. We're just following up." Jason's mom tried to remain calm. "My son doesn't cause trouble," she said, her voice firm. "You can't just accuse him without cause." But the officer wasn't backing down. "It's not about accusations, ma'am. It's about investigation. You know how it is. We have to follow the law." Jason could feel the heat rising in his chest, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "I'm not some criminal. I've never done anything wrong," he blurted out, unable to contain his frustration any longer. The officers exchanged a look. One of them took a step closer to Jason. "Let's just keep this civil." "All right," the officer said, his voice laced with condescension. "We're just doing our job." Jason wanted to scream. He wanted to tell them everything, how unfair it all was, how he had always been treated differently. But he couldn't. He had to stand there, just a bystander in his own life. While people who didn't know him judged him, the officers continued to question him, ignoring the truth that was right in front of them. Jason's chest tightened with every word they spoke. He was being blamed for something he didn't do. He wasn't the one who caused the trouble, but in their eyes, he was already guilty. As the officers finished their report and walked away, Jason stood frozen in place, his mind racing. What would happen next? As the door closed behind them, he felt the weight of the world settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just being accused anymore. He was being labeled. And now, things were about to spiral out of control. What would it take for him to finally be seen as just Jason, not a target, not a stereotype, just himself? The question lingered, unanswered, as the quiet night stretched on. The storm was far from over, and Jason knew that whatever came next would change everything. The day had come. The air outside felt like it was about to crack open, hot and heavy with the weight of what was unfolding. Jason stood in front of the school's courtyard, the scene before him nothing but a blur of faces, some curious, some judgmental. The buzz of whispers was relentless, a steady hum that gnawed at the back of his mind. The last few days had been a blur. After the officers left that night, things had only escalated. Jason's name had been dragged through the dirt by Mr. Walker, painted as a troublemaker in the eyes of his neighbors, his teachers, and even some of his friends. But today was the final straw. Today, the school board meeting would decide everything. Jason had kept his head down as best he could, trying to ignore the stares, the accusations, but it wasn't easy. He had spent the last few days barely holding it together, the pressure of the entire situation pressing against him like a vice. He knew what this was about, Mr. Walker's lies, the twisted rumors. He had been labeled a threat simply because of the color of his skin. And now, the school board was deciding whether or not he would face expulsion for a crime he didn't commit. The entire school was watching. "Jason Hunter," the principal's voice echoed across the loudspeaker, pulling him back into the moment. "Please come forward." Jason took a deep breath and stood up, his legs shaking but his resolve hardening. This was it. There was no going back now. He walked to the front of the room, the murmurs of the crowd growing louder as he passed them, his every step carrying the weight of everyone's assumptions. The room was packed, filled with parents, teachers, and students who all seemed to be waiting for a verdict. Jason's eyes met Mr. Walker's for a brief moment, and he could see the smirk on the older man's face. He felt a surge of rage bubble up, but he swallowed it. This wasn't about him getting angry. It was about taking control. "Jason," the principal began, "you've been accused of harassment and threatening behavior. There have been several reports filed against you by Mr. Walker. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The entire room felt like it was closing in on him. The eyes of the board members, the teachers, and even students he'd grown up with were all locked on him. He could hear the whispers, the doubts in their voices, all of them believing what they had been told, but Jason couldn't let them decide for him. He couldn't let them define him as the troublemaker, as the threat just because he was different. He couldn't remain silent anymore. "Actually, yes, I do," Jason said, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. His hands clenched at his sides, fists tight as he stood before the board. "I've been labeled a troublemaker, a threat, and I've been trying to keep my head down, to just survive. But I can't anymore. I won't be silenced." A murmur ran through the room as Jason paused, letting his words sink in. He knew he was taking a risk. He knew they might not believe him, that the bias was already too ingrained. But he couldn't back down now. "I've never hurt anyone," he continued, his voice rising, the frustration pouring out with every word. "I don't deserve to be treated like this. You're judging me because of the color of my skin, because I don't look like everyone else. Mr. Walker and others like him have created this narrative about me, painting me as something I'm not. But I am just me. I'm not a criminal. I'm not a threat. I'm a kid trying to make it through life just like everyone else." His words hung in the air, the room falling into an eerie silence. Jason's breath came faster now, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the doubt still in their eyes. But something had shifted. He was no longer the quiet kid, hiding behind his headphones. He was standing up for himself. He was fighting back. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jason said, his voice breaking slightly. "But you want to know what hurts the most. It's not being accused. It's not being misunderstood. It's being ignored. It's knowing that no matter how hard I try, no matter how hard I work, people like me will always have to fight harder to prove that we belong." The room was still. Jason could see the principal's eyes flicker with uncertainty. Mr. Walker was no longer smiling, his face tight with anger. But Jason didn't care anymore. He had said it. He had spoken the truth. And then, something remarkable happened. One by one, the teachers in the room began to nod. Mrs. Carter, his history teacher, the one who had always given him that skeptical look, was now looking at him with something different in her eyes. Recognition, not judgment, but understanding. Then, his coach, Mr. Simmons, leaned forward in his seat. The most powerful moment, though, came when Malik stood up in the back of the room. He wasn't just a friend, he was Jason's ally. The one person who had always seen the truth. "Jason's right," Malik said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We've all seen it. He's not the problem here. It's the people who judge him before they even get to know him. It's the people who let their fear of something different control them." Jason's heart raced. The weight had lifted, just a little. He wasn't alone. Walker tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "This isn't right. He's trouble. But no one was listening anymore. The principal stood, his face pale. "We'll take a vote," he said, clearly shaken by the change in the room. As Jason stood there, surrounded by the teachers and students who had begun to see the truth, a quiet victory started to settle in. It wasn't over yet, but it was a turning point.